Welcome back to the Judgment Files. Today we're diving into a case that really hits at the heart of what symbols mean and just how far free speech goes.
Yeah.
It's Texas v. Johnson.
Big one.
And you shared some fascinating material, excerpts from the Supreme Court's own records. So our mission is to unpack this landmark 1989 decision about burning the American flag.
Yeah, we've got the syllabus from the court, and we've got the majority opinion, and we've got dissenting opinions. And I'll tell you.
Oh, yeah.
These documents are packed with not just the facts of the case, but the legal reasoning and some pretty passionate arguments on both sides of this issue.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really, really interesting case.
Yeah.
And so our deep dive is going to zero in on why burning a flag became a First Amendment question in the first place.
Right.
And ultimately what the Supreme Court decided. We'll be kind of navigating this tension between freedom of speech and this really powerful symbolism of the American flag.
Yeah.
Get ready for some surprises.
Yeah, and this is a case that I think a lot of people think they know what it's about. But we're going to uncover some legal complexities maybe they haven't thought about.
Absolutely.
Surrounding what might seem like a straightforward act.
Okay, let's set the scene.
Great.
Where and when did all this unfold?
Well, the stage was set in Dallas, Texas in 1984.
Okay.
During the Republican National Convention.
Fair.
And there was a man named Gregory Lee Johnson, and he became central to a protest, really targeting the Reagan administration and some of the corporations that were in Dallas at the time.
So this wasn't just a guy on a street corner with a sign. This was an organized demonstration.
This was a march through the streets of Dallas.
Wow.
Which culminated in front of Dallas City Hall, and that is where things went down.
That's where the flag burning itself happened.
That's right.
Can you walk us through what happened?
Absolutely. So when the protesters arrived at Dallas City Hall,
okay,
Johnson unfurled an American flag.
Okay.
He doused it with kerosene.
Oh, wow.
And lit it on fire. And this occurred in the presence of other demonstrators chanting.
Okay, so it's this really kind of dramatic scene unfolding. Now, it's important to highlight what didn't happen based on these documents. There was no physical injury. There were no threats of violence.
No, there were no reports of anyone being injured,
Right.
and critically, no threats of violence.
Right.
However, that doesn't mean people weren't upset. It was clear from the witnesses that people were offended.
Right, so people were seriously offended.
Yes.
But there was no actual violence or threat of immediate violence.
That's important.
Okay, so Johnson gets arrested. What law did he allegedly break?
So Johnson was convicted under a Texas law that prohibited the desecration of a venerated object.
Venerated object.
Venerated object. And I mean, that's kind of an interesting legal term.
It is interesting, yeah.
Because what does that really mean?
Right.
But it was clear to the prosecutors, and the initial court agreed, that the American flag fell under that definition.
Okay, so the Texas legal system upholds this conviction, right?
Well, initially, yeah, the Texas Court of Appeals initially agreed. But as we know, the legal process doesn't end there.
That's right, because then the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals steps in and totally reverses that decision. Why? What's the core of their reasoning here?
So the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, looking at the context of the whole thing, the political protest, the chanting, they conclude that punishing Johnson for this amounted to a violation of the First Amendment.
Okay, so this is where we hit this idea of expressive conduct. So the court's seeing his actions as more than just destruction. They're interpreting it as a form of communication.
Yes, they deemed it to be symbolic speech.
Symbolic speech.
So, given that this was an organized demonstration with a political message, it was clear that observers would understand this was a statement.
A statement, not just a random destructive act.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating here is that this introduced the concept that actions can be communicative.
Yeah, actions can speak louder than words, as they say.
That's right. And it can get really tricky in the law to figure out, well, when is an action actually speech?
Right.
When is it protected?
Exactly. And so then the Supreme Court takes this upright, this question of whether flag burning can be considered speech protected by the First Amendment. What did they say?
So the Supreme Court, they're looking back at this long history of cases, and they reaffirm that conduct can be imbued with communicative elements.
Okay, so give us some examples, because I know they reference some past cases in their decision.
Yeah, so they look back at cases like Tinker v. Des Moines, where students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War.
Right.
And that was considered expressive conduct,
Okay.
protected by the First Amendment.
Okay.
They also cited Brown v. Louisiana, which dealt with sit-ins.
Right, the sit-ins to protest racial segregation.
Exactly. And so we see these nonverbal actions, but they're done with the intent to communicate a message, and they're likely understood by others as conveying that message.
Right, and so, as you said, it's kind of solidifying this idea that actions can really speak volumes. And in fact, Justice Brennan, who wrote the majority opinion, even pointed out that flags themselves are already loaded with symbolism.
Yeah, and this is so interesting because the court really digs into the idea of what does the flag represent, what does it mean?
Yeah.
And they say that it's this visible manifestation of 200 years of nationhood. So just by its very nature, it's a symbol.
They even go on to talk about previous cases that dealt with flag-related conduct, like attaching a peace symbol to a flag in Stents v. Washington and students refusing to salute the flag in Barnett.
Right, so it's clear that there's this history of the court grappling with what kind of conduct involving the flag is protected.
Yeah.
And even the state of Texas admitted during oral arguments that Johnson's conduct was expressive.
Wow, so even the state
Correct.
conceded that it was expressive conduct. So, okay, the court agrees this is expressive conduct, which means those First Amendment protections are in play. But Texas still argues that they had the right to prohibit it.
They did.
What were their main arguments for that?
So they had two main arguments. One was to prevent breaches of the peace, and two was to preserve the flag as a symbol of national unity.
Okay, so let's break that down. Let's start with the breach of the peace argument. What did the Supreme Court have to say about that?
Well, they concluded that in this specific case, this interest didn't really apply. So they emphasize that the flag burning itself didn't lead to any actual public disorder, no violence.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah. Now, some people were offended, we know that, but the court makes a really important distinction here.
Yeah.
Offense does not equal incitement to violence.
That's a huge distinction.
Yeah, I mean, that's like cornerstone First Amendment principle.
It is, yeah. So
Yeah.
feeling offended and being provoked to violence are not the same.
No, not at all. And they go back and they look at cases like Terminiella v. Chicago,
Okay.
where the court said, listen, the purpose of free speech is to invite debate, and sometimes that stirs up strong emotions, even anger.
Right. It's not always going to be polite or agreeable.
Right, exactly. And then they look at Brandenburg v. Ohio, where they said, you know, the government can't just presume that every provocative idea will lead to a riot.
Right.
They've got to consider the circumstances.
Well, that's the specific facts of the situation.
Exactly. And so they're saying, look, the threshold to suppress speech based on potential disorder is very high.
Yeah, it's got to be pretty clear and present danger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also determined that Johnson's actions didn't meet that really narrow definition of fighting words, which comes from Toplinsky v. New Hampshire.
Right. So fighting words being those specifically directed at another person that are likely to provoke immediate violence.
Right. So like a face-to-face insult.
Yeah.
That's designed to provoke a fight right then and there. And the court's saying, look, burning a flag at a political demonstration is not the same thing.
Not even close.
It's broader political speech.
It's a different category.
Yeah.
And what's also interesting is they pointed out that Texas already had a separate law specifically prohibiting breaches of the peace.
They did, and this is huge. Because the court basically says, look, Texas already has a tool to deal with actual disruptions of public order.
Yeah.
You don't need to use this other statute to punish flag desecration.
Right, because it's too broad. Okay, so that breach of the peace argument, that doesn't fly here in this context.
Huh?
What about that second argument about preserving the flag as a symbol of national unity? What do they say about that?
So they acknowledge the flag has huge symbolic power. It represents the nation. But they determine that the state's interest in preserving that symbolism is about suppressing expression.
Okay, so the state is saying, hey, we need to be able to punish this because it offends people, it undermines this symbol of unity.
Right, and the court's saying, no, you're trying to control a message here.
You're trying to control what people can say, even if it's with an action.
Exactly.
Okay.
So because it's related to the message, they can't use this less stringent test called the O'Brien test.
Okay, so explain that. What is the O'Brien test and why doesn't it apply here?
Okay, so the O'Brien test comes from a case called United States v. O'Brien. And in that case, the court said, look, if the government regulation is about something other than suppressing speech, then we're going to apply this less stringent test.
Okay.
But in this case, the court says, no, this Texas law is focused on the message.
Right. It's not just a general law about damaging property or something like that.
Right.
It's specifically about, flag desecration,
Right.
with the intent to offend.
That's right. It's about the message.
Yeah.
And it's content-based.
Content-based.
Because they're saying you can't do something to the flag that would cause serious offense. It's not just about any physical mistreatment. It's about the offense.
Right. And so the fact that it's content-based, that means it's targeting a certain viewpoint or message, triggers this much higher level of scrutiny.
That's right.
The court calls it the most exacting scrutiny.
Exactly. And this means the state has to show a really compelling interest and that this law is narrowly tailored and there's no other way to achieve it.
And they just can't meet that standard.
No, they can't.
Right.
Because the court reaffirms this principle. The government can't prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds it offensive.
Right. That even if we, the majority of people, find something offensive,
Yeah.
we can't just outlaw it.
Exactly. And that even applies to cherished symbols like the flag.
Right.
So it's really about protecting those unpopular viewpoints.
Right. And then they bring back that case we mentioned earlier, West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett, the one about the mandatory flag salute.
Right. And in that case, the court said, look, you can't compel unity of opinion.
Yeah.
You can't tell people what symbols have to mean to them.
Yeah.
And you can't force people to endorse a particular view.
Right. Okay, so in the end, what was the majority's conclusion?
Well, they uphold the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. They say that Johnson's conviction was inconsistent with the First Amendment.
So they basically said you can't punish someone for burning a flag.
Exactly.
In this context.
In this context.
As a form of political protest.
That's right. And they made it clear this is not about commercial uses of the flag.
Right.
Like Halter v. Nebraska, where it was about using the flag in advertising.
Right.
And they also said this is not about trademark protections like San Francisco Arts and Athletics v. U.S. Olympic Committee.
Right. So this case is really narrowly about political protest.
That's right.
Yeah.
They're not trying to overturn all these other cases.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also reject this idea of a special exception to the First Amendment just for the flag.
Exactly.
They say that would go against what the flag actually stands for.
Exactly.
So now Justice Kennedy, who joined the majority, he also wrote his own separate concurring opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What was he trying to emphasize?
Well, Justice Kennedy, he really focuses on the role of a judge, the duty to uphold the Constitution, even when you don't like the outcome.
Right.
So he acknowledges the dissent has some powerful arguments.
Sure.
But he says, listen, even those who hold the flag in contempt are protected by the Constitution. And his line is really powerful. It is poignant but fundamental that the flag protects those who hold it in contempt.
Yeah, that is powerful. Okay, so now let's talk about those dissenting opinions, because as you said, they do make some strong points. Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote one, and Justices White and O'Connor joined him.
Wow.
What was the heart of their disagreement with the majority?
So they argued the flag is not just any symbol. It holds a unique and special place in American history and identity.
Okay.
And that justifies prohibiting its burning.
Yeah.
And they go back through history to make their case.
Give us some examples of what they're talking about, this history that they are referencing.
So they talk about its role in the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
They talk about its importance during the War of 1812, specifically referencing the Star-Spangled Banner in Fort McHenry. They talk about its unifying force during the Civil War. They even mention the story of Barbara Frietchie, which is a poem about a woman who waves the Union flag as Confederate troops march through town. Then they highlight its importance in both world wars, in the Korean War, in Vietnam, and how it affected troop morale. And then they point to all these laws and resolutions that honor the flag to say, look, it's not just a piece of cloth.
Right. So they're basically saying you can't compare this to any other symbol.
Right. And then they take on this idea that flag burning is an essential way to express ideas.
Right.
And they say, absolutely not. And not only that, they say it has a real potential to incite violence. They draw a parallel to fighting words again.
Right. Okay, so what about those other cases that we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
About using the flag in commercial context. They reference those as well.
Yes. They bring up Halter and San Francisco Arts and Athletics to bolster their argument that the government has a legitimate interest in protecting the flag's value. And they really criticize the majority for saying it's just another symbol. They say, no, the government has a right to protect something this important from what they see as offensive conduct.
Right, even if it means some limitations on expression. Okay, so now we've got Justice Stevens. He wrote a separate dissenting opinion. What's his main point?
Justice Stevens makes a really interesting argument. He says the flag is more than just nationhood. It embodies the ideals of freedom, equal opportunity, religious tolerance.
Wow.
So he's saying it's not just about being American. It's about those values.
Yeah.
And he says protecting that for future generations is completely legitimate. And he sees desecration of the flag as tarnishing that.
So he's drawing a line, right, between this and other forms of protest.
He is. He says this is not like other forms of protest. He says it's like defacing a monument. It diminishes something that belongs to everyone.
Right. And he doesn't see the Texas law as trying to force a specific viewpoint on people, right?
Right. He says, no, this isn't about prescribing orthodoxy. It's not about forcing people to agree. He says it's about the offense itself.
Right. The act of desecrating something so symbolically important to the nation. So as we can see from this deep dive into Texas v. Johnson, there's this huge tension between free expression and reverence for this national symbol.
That's a clash of values.
It is. And the court comes down pretty firmly on the side of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Even when the speech involved is offensive.
It's really fascinating.
It is. So I think this leaves us with a lot to think about. Does the unique history of the flag justify special protections?
Right.
Even if it means limiting expressive freedom.
Right, because the counter-argument is that freedom to express those views, even offensive ones, essential for a free nation.
Exactly. It's this fundamental tension. This case, it continues to spark debate.
Yeah, it does.
It forces us to look at these boundaries of free speech.
And how we think about our national symbols.
Absolutely. It's also a reminder that these complex legal questions, they're really tied into these deeply held beliefs. We encourage you to think about this, maybe even look into the history of flag desecration laws, see how these discussions are evolving, what people are saying today. We'll see you next time at the Judgment Files.